Okay, we're live.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting of the Mahone Bay Town Council. All the council is here with some of our staff as well. And we certainly welcome the folks at home who are going to be watching this on the YouTube channel. So we'll call the meeting to order. And we'll begin by acknowledging that we are gathered tonight in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral present and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Tonight, we gather with the intent followed by the living peace and friendship treaties, and we do so with respect, cooperation, and coexistence. And with that, I will note that we do have an agenda that was emailed to the members of council, and I think it was posted in town. What is your wish with the agenda?
Mayor, I'd move that we accept the agenda as proposed.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Carver, you've heard the motion. On the question, all in favor? The motion is carried. We are, among other things, having a discussion, a pre-budget discussion tonight. Item number 2, the first actual topic on the agenda. And CAO, did you have any opening comments?
Well, actually, this meeting was called on request, motion by Councillor Wilson to discuss the preparation for the budget. So I think probably most appropriate if Councillor Wilson wants to introduce it, I guess go back to what his original thoughts were, if that's okay. Okay, thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. I can do that. Yes, my thinking when I suggested this discussion was that it seems to me to be productive for council to sit down, and if we have any kind of parameters around what we want the budget to look like, to thrash them out before staff spend dozens and dozens of hours working through a bunch of detail and then bring it back to us and we say, no, wrong answer, go back and do it again, which often is what happens. And I had thought a bit about it, and I know one of the problems that, I guess, a philosophical problem that I have with probably every CAO in the province, if not the country, is my belief that you should develop a sensible budget with a bottom line and then go back and look at the assessment and the rate and figure out what rate you need to get the money to drive the budget. And there is a great reluctance, I think, in most quarters to ever revisit the tax rate unless it's going in an upward direction. This year in particular, I think, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you look at our overall assessment, which is some combination of increase in prices and construction and new purchases and so on, our overall assessment is going up by 20%. So if we leave the rate alone, it means the tax increase for the people of Mahone Bay is going to be 20%, which to my mind is A, inappropriate, and B, untenable. So with that said, I had jotted down some notes about the kinds of things that we might want to talk about. So, for example, that we may want to say that the total operating budget for next year will be no greater than last year's budget plus the cost of living index plus 1% or plus 0.5%, or pick a number. That we might want to talk about the fact that our current G&A account, that's basically the account that houses the salaries for staff, is 32% of our operating budget, and the town average in Nova Scotia is 16%. So our G&A account is twice as large as the municipal average in the province. And that we might want to think about a 5-year objective to say, let's get that G&A account back down to the town average, which would mean reducing it by 3% per year over 5 years. We might want to consider that we should adjust the tax rate to achieve the total budget cost rather than building a budget that consumes all the dollars available by if you leave the tax rate alone. The other piece, and this is, well, I'm a bit at sea at this because I don't really understand it all that well, but I know we have to have more money in our operating contingency fund. And I don't know exactly how that's been done in the past. I know that during the course of the year, there's a lot of toing and froing where, you know, we decide that such and such a project will be funded by the surplus account, and then we have some extra money somewhere else and we put that back in. I think that we should be, as part of the operating budget, building an amount of money in that we need to get that operating contingency account up to where it needs to be, A, to keep the province off our back, but B, to give Dylan and his staff some comfort level that we have some protection. And finally, I think we think about this notionally, but I'm not sure we actually do it, that we have a bunch of ancillary income streams that come in, and notionally they are supposed to go to capital. And that is the things like the gas tax, our infrastructure charge, which is $295 per lot or whatever, per PID, the deed transfer tax, and there might be others. That if they are supposed to be capital only, that during the budget process, that money should never be seen in the operating account. It should go straight to capital, to the funds that are set up for that purpose. So those are just some of the items that I thought were worth talking about, and I will shut up now. Thank you.
Okay. Other comments? Councillor Feeney.
So, you know, that's music to my ears. I think I agree wholeheartedly with Kelly's view of the world. Just a couple things to make sure we're kind of all on the same page, and Dylan, chime in if I'm off base here. You know, I think we had a CPI that we're using of 4.8%. I heard that number last week at the Joint Services Board Finance Committee meeting, and I think there's a general, I think Mahone Bay and Bridgewater are using that number, and Modal's using a slightly different number, but I think that's sort of our plan. So as table setting, to Kelly's point, if we're at, say, 40% of our budget is salaries, we know those salaries are going up just based on the inflation factor by, let's call it 5%. So, I mean, things are more expensive. I think everyone sort of understands that reality. It's my understanding, and I think this is a good number, and I think Kelly's number is right, that the overall portfolio of assessment, the overall tax base is up about 20%. And I think, to my knowledge and kind of previous conversations with Dylan, and you know, it's a blend of about 50-50, like 50% of that increase is coming from organic growth, and 50% of it is coming from new builds, with the biggest driver, of course, being the senior citizens complex up the street, being a big driver of that growth. And you know, based on many conversations within the PVSC over the last 6 or 8 weeks, I think the general theme is that, like, that spike of increased tax base isn't unusual. Isn't unusual to Mahone Bay. We're seeing that kind of across the province, but Mahone Bay and Lunenburg are the two highest in the province. So that's, I guess, an indication of value, and the value that people find coming here because there's great demand for new builds. The other reality is, I think this is part of the overall long-term storyboard, is this is not a one-year phenomenon. Like, we are going to see another large assessment increase next year and another one the year after that for a couple of reasons. One is that even now, when you see the increased assessments, those assessments aren't really illustrative of market values. And so I even look across the street at a home that just went on the market and it's being priced at, 250% above assessment value as an illustration. Now, even if that house across the street sells tomorrow, it will still be many years before the assessment rises based on the assessment methodologies. So I guess the takeaway here is that we're going to see higher assessments. It's going to be high, and they're going to rise heartily. It's important for our council to really understand that driver, because the idea that we wouldn't adjust tax rates accordingly, to Kelly's point, is illogical. I mean, in Lunenburg, this happened in Lunenburg last year, where they had the highest assessment increase in the province, and they still increased the tax rate. Like that, it's, I guess, my observation, for what it's worth, and then I'll pass the baton back to the rest of you, is that according to the documentation we had from the province last year, the tax load is the highest in Mahone Bay of any place in the province. So property tax as a percentage of average household income is very, very high here. So it's true that the mix of the people who live here is changing because we've had so much real estate turnover, but for people who have lived here a long time, I think is really a hard hill to climb. When you talk about 7 or 8% of your entire household income going to Mahone Bay property taxes, I think there's a limitation there. We were at 5.6% in 2019, 2020. You got to figure it's a couple points higher than that now. Like, that is a big number. 6-7% of people take an entire household income just paying the Mahone Bay property tax. So, I think those are some of the influencers, I think, of where we're heading. And I think this is a worthwhile conversation to have over the next 2 months.
Thank you, Councillor Feeney. Other comments? Deputy Mayor Kangata.
So I think there's probably no need to repeat all that's been said. To me, makes sense to think about the impact this will have on folks in their pockets and from an economic standpoint, how that figures out. There's also, I think, from my perspective, the conversation about our ambitions and what they are based on the strategic plan that we have, and how that features in these budget deliberations. I think since this will be my first budget process, I have very little to go on other than the last one, which I felt in many ways I was learning, sort of asking myself whether this is the process that can get us a good result. And so this will be, I guess, a second stab at it, and in many ways still a learning process for me. But I think if those opportunities to have conversations about what the margins that we expect, like margins of increase, what room we have to play with for which particular budgets, I think those are important conversations to have beforehand. So at least, like it's been mentioned, staff have a clear idea what we are comfortable with or what the driver is. But also on the same token, not shackle them so much that then it becomes difficult to actually pull the numbers together. We will have a new person in that finance office, and so there will be challenges for that person to sort of grapple with what they're coming into and be able to guide us into this process. I'm glad we're starting now. The question I have, I think, right now in my mind is, so how do we develop those parameters? What should be our guiding template? And sort of saying, well, these are what council is thinking to be the non-negotiables for our budget, and then have a deliberation about those, and just be clear and concise about those. That would be, I think, if I was staff, that would be very helpful for me. Zach. So folks who've thought about it a bit more, it might be helpful to also mention, how do we get to that place, that we have a nice tidy list of the things that we feel are pretty important for us.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Other comments? Mr. Hyde, is the Deputy Mayor's suggestion, is that something that we can achieve, identify in our budget? I mean, there are things which we literally have no choice but to pay or pay for. There are services that we provide, required to provide, if you will. Can we differentiate in our budget pieces the mandatories, the must-haves, and the want-to-haves, and the nice-to-haves? So we get a bit of relative priority to the different items that we might be costing out. Is that a doable thing, or CAO?
Well, to the direct question, I think that the way that I'd kind of respond to that is when you're talking about what is actually an absolute requirement of municipal government, you're still not usually talking about the level of service that is required. So, we have to have policing services. We have to have fire services. We have to do snow removal in the winter. We need to provide the utilities that we currently provide. But we don't have to do any of it well. But there's nothing in the law saying that. So I think it's important to note that, there are levels of discretion, and communities can indicate that, savings on the tax bill are more important than higher levels of service. But that relationship between, oh, I got my tax bill and it's a little bit higher than it was last year, and, oh, wow, all those services that are being provided to me are being provided with no reduction in service levels. There's still just as many police serving the community. The fire department has, up-to-date equipment and an up-to-date facility to operate from. So I think it's a bit challenging. And certainly we always highlight the strategic initiatives. So to the Deputy Mayor's point about, the things in the budget that might be termed discretionary might be the ones that are council's expressed priorities, the things that are not just the simple decision about do we do more snow clearing or less snow clearing, but rather, do we have commitments to environmental sustainability? Those type of things are considered to be council's priorities. Those are also considered to be, I suppose, the more discretionary areas of the budget. Generally, when we approach the budget at staff level over the last number of years, any of those initiatives that are not part of the kind of core operating, as it were, are broken out as being operating initiatives. So they're funded from operating reserve. They represent a relatively short term in the overall picture of the town, an impermanent expenditure to address a specific priority of a current council. And so typically those are reserve funded to avoid any distortion in the tax rate. So taxes don't take a big jump because we're developing a housing strategy. If we spend money on an item that is of strategic importance, it can come out of that operating reserve. And I think that's an appropriate way to approach it. So we certainly want to provide council with guidance around where that, I think Francis had said, room to play with, within the budget. There are areas where, we have more discretion over the service level and we have less. Policing services, the reduction is very dramatic from where we are now. There aren't a lot of options below where we are now. So, knowing that is relatively the minimal level, then the fact that we're anticipating a double-digit increase in costs under the provincial police services agreement due to rapidly rising RCMP costs across the country, that's going to hit us regardless, and it's not really something we have discretion over. And I guess that brings me around to my concern over the math of whether it's CPI plus 1% or whatever the fixed expenditure change from the prior year Certainly there are some things like salary growth that, within our organization that we do have control over. Some expenditures, somewhat discretionary, others, have to be purchased at a set price. So RCMP services will increase in cost, and they'll increase by more than 6%. So to stick to a budget constraint like prior year expenditures plus, obviously that means cutting one department to pay for increases in another. And I think that could be pretty challenging. Why you would reduce service levels in terms of, say, road maintenance in order to increase the cost of the same level of policing services people received the prior year. It's important to communicate that reduction in cost comes at a cost to the average resident. So I think the most important point was the deputy mayor's point that any direction needs to be clear. So staff can, relatively speaking, provide the options within the budget. But I think it should also be understood that much of the time, the things that give way in the face of rising inflexible costs or costs that are relatively outside of our control are those areas that are especially valued by council and I think by the community. So that's the challenge that we kind of run into. And then I just wanted to take, since we've been around a bit and there was room for comment, the one comment that I had been waiting to make just was with regards to the historic context that we're coming out of now, more than 30 years. This is not specific to Mahone Bay, this is common across the country, of underfunding infrastructure. So we talk a lot about the infrastructure deficit in the country, the major investments that were made by previous generations, but not within relatively recent memory. And we know better than ever before, because we have the asset management information to back it up, how much money is going to be needed just to sustain current infrastructure. And council often talks about improvements of that infrastructure and improvements of the services that it is able to offer to residents. So if we have a bit of a unique circumstance, both in terms of new assessment with the nursing home and other significant new construction, and also in terms of rising assessments, although less so, this may represent a unique opportunity to be able to pay ahead for the next 30, 40 years of infrastructure, to be able to make up for perhaps underfunding that infrastructure to the same tune that we're now able to address. So I just want to encourage council to see the opportunity there, and particularly with regards to assessment resulting from a boom in construction, which doesn't actually represent an increase in the taxes being paid by any individual. And then just a final comment on taxes paid by the individual and the sort of residential tax burden as an indicator, and certainly it is an important indicator, but it is also pegged to the 2016 census, which means that for all of the last 5 years, our residential tax burden has grown, but it has grown because you're simply dividing one number by another number, and one number has stayed constant since 2016 because it is only updated every 5 years. So we will see a jump in the residential tax burden based on census that will fall this year, regardless. So that's just a small comment, but in terms of the use of that indicator, it's bound to have ended up a little bit skewed at the end of a census period. So that's just a few comments.
Okay. Councillor Wilson and then Councillor Feeney.
Yes, a couple of things. I think the first thing we have to recognize is that roughly $700,000 of our operating budget is out of our hands. That's, we write a check to the school board and we write a check to the Mounties, and that money's whatever it is, and we have no control over it. So that leaves about $1.8 million roughly of our budget that we do have control over. And around 660,000 of that is the G&A account, not to harp on an issue. But I think we have to pay attention to what we can pay attention to. And I think there are opportunities. One of the things that I will, I guess, take exception to is the notion that being careful about costs and reducing costs where you can necessarily implies a reduction in service quality or quantity. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies have proven that improved quality is less expensive than shoddy quality. So I think properly managed we can provide an exemplary product to our taxpayers at a lower cost if we choose to, but it takes focus and it takes discipline, and that's my fundamental concern, is that I guess I'll say what I say to myself all the time, which is if you have a budget where going into it, you're probably, and it's let's say whatever ours is, $2.6 million operating budget, and basically that at the end of the year you're going to have a $700,000 or $800,000 surplus, you can be fairly relaxed about how you manage things. But if you have a $200.8 million budget and it's close to the wire, you got to pay attention. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that Dylan's not paying attention. I'm just saying that there's a psychological thing that creeps into systems and organizations that can be dangerous, I guess is the word I would use.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Feeney.
I was kind of searching for an analogy, and this is the best I've come up with. So it may not make as much sense, but we really have like apples and oranges and pears, and our apples are our operating expenses, and our oranges are capital expenses, and our pears are the fire service expenses, all of which dovetail to different streams of revenue. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the tax rate and the assessment. And the increase of assessment is obviously going to help us finance the first two, the operating costs and the fire costs, because they go directly, but they don't really speak to Dylan's third point, which is infrastructure costs. To my knowledge, we are the only town in the province that finance 100% of capital items out of individually dedicated revenue streams. And conversely, we are absolutely the only province does not spend 1 cent of our tax rate on capital. 0. In fact, in my tenure on council, we've also now are funding all the interest payments on the capital out of the capital revenue streams. So when we talk about our tax rate, I just think people are always amazed when I say not 1 cent of the tax rate goes to water, sewer, upgrades of infrastructure of any kind, nor has it for many, many years, because we're very fortunate to have these revenue streams that we talk about all the time that most towns don't. So when other towns are talking about their tax rate deliberations and litigation of what the tax rate should be, they're funding both the apples and the oranges. We're only funding the oranges, to Kelly's point. So if we want to fund more capital, I'm completely open-minded about talking about it, but I think it would be incredibly unrealistic to think that we're going to start funding capital out of that operating streams for 2 reasons. One, the province wants us to spend less in operating and put more into the operating reserve. Last year, we actually took money out of the capital reserve to prop up operating. So the idea that we're going to start taking operating revenue and we're going to start diverting it to bridges, roads, sewers, that's just not going to happen. That's just not reality. So I do think that if we are going to talk about increased capital improvements, to Dylan's point, and I agree with Dylan's analysis of the issue wholeheartedly, and I think we all have aspirational objectives for the town about where the next tranche of capital improvement should be. Whether the deputy mayor spoke eloquently about that the last couple of meetings about, opportunities to quiet down traffic, make it a more pedestrian and cycling friendly community, fixing up the waterfront. None of that comes from the tax rate, not 1 cent. So the only way we're going to get more money to do those things is figure out how we're going to get more money from the capital drivers. And it's really only going to come from the infrastructure fees. And then, so I think we've been so all I'm suggesting is that there's a number of ways for us to get at the revenue streams that we want to get at. We don't always have to just toggle the tax rate. We can also change the infrastructure fee. We could lower the tax rate, increase the infrastructure fee. We could, there's a lot of different angles to try to fund the things that we think are the most mission critical as part of the strategic plan. So I just don't think we should be handcuffed into saying that we're going to just adjust the tax rate. I think, and finally, I know I've been kind of going on at length here. I think, Dylan, to put your mind at ease, I think our budget, probably you're right, it can't be constrained at 5%, but even at 10% would allow, even if the budget increased 10%, the operating budget, it still wouldn't require us to change the tax rate, because we've got more people contributing now. We've got another $20 million of tax base. So there are more of us. We've got the economies of scale now that we didn't have a year ago or 2 years ago. So we've got more people sharing the pain. Even at a 10% increase of operating expenses, I think everyone could live with that if we had to go that high. And it would not, without having an increased tax rate at all. Like, we would just keep the tax rate flat, and we could, it would allow the operating budget to grow by at least 10%.
Deputy Mayor?
So in the way this, I guess, comes to my mind in simple ways is a sort of one of the, I guess, points of agreement you can agree upon is that whatever we do this particular budget period, we're not going to increase tax rates. We can simply agree on that. Yes. And sort of say that's something we don't want to see, and put that, I guess, sort of in the parking lot, so to speak. So staff know they'll have to play around with the numbers, but the tax rate, we're not increasing it. And then let's move on to the next one and sort of say, so what's the next piece that we want to talk about? And I think Dylan has sort of shared with us some infrastructure pieces that maybe we can talk about those and see, well, what kind of impact would this have? And do we still want to continue pursuing them as aggressively as we have, or just list them there and not even do them because there's no matching funding from the province or things like that? Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. If we can sort of be laying, as we finish a conversation, we lay down sort of what's the agreement here. It might be very helpful so that we can, I guess, move on to the next pieces. And from all of us who've spoken so far, I feel the sense that we don't want to increase the tax rate. I know Kelly has mentioned a reduction. I'm thinking it might not be possible, but maybe it might be. I think I can agree to we will not increase the tax rate because I don't know whether a reduction might be possible. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Any other comments? Councillor Burdick.
Thank you. I would agree to that. I think the repeating theme, and I'm sure for years now, has been infrastructure. So it's finding ways to ensure that at least one or two of these projects can at least be started, if not completed in the next year, hopefully completed also. But that was a very clarifying for me to know that the tax, it's not coming from the taxes in terms of property taxes that would contribute to that. So, and I know that we're going to be talking later about Icip, or however you pronounce it. But yeah, I would agree to that as a baseline at keeping those taxes static. Don't think they could be lowered particularly.
Okay. CAO, did you want to comment?
Yeah, well, I certainly do think that that's a good direction, like that staff be directed to present the 22 23 budget with no increase in tax rate does seem like a straight directive, and we can comply with that. I just have a bit of a follow-up question, not to overly complicate, but Councillor Feeney put it out that there are 3 baskets, and so capital's not coming off that tax rate. At least that's not what we've done in the past. And fire was identified as another basket. So the fire does have its own effective tax rate now. We started that last year, and it will benefit from the sizable increase in assessment, obviously. But relative to the rest of the budget, we had a clear understanding that the fire rate would be increasing as a result of the significant capital expenditures that have happened and are planned over the next year. So I was wondering from council, like, would you be looking to see no change in the fire rate, which is so effectively the fire rate is taking less of the responsibility for the costs associated with the fire? It may be a moot point, because if we allow the entire benefit of any increase that happens as a result of assessment on the side of the fire to accrue to fire operating, then I'm more than confident fire operating is there. And so it becomes more of a question of, contributions to fire capital and, where we expect those to come from. I'm just wondering if that's understood to be an objective, keeping the fire rate relative to the base tax rate the same as it currently is, even though we had discussed prior to the new assessment figures that it would be going up.
Councillor Feeney?
Mayor, so, I think, Dylan, my view on that is that the council also has to be advocates for the customers that live outside of the jurisdiction. And I know you've had conversations with some of those other community representatives sort of down in Mater's Cove. So there's very real nuances about the competition to provide that service in some of those jurisdictions, especially Mater's Cove. So I think council was, over the last 2 years, have been informed by these, let's call it $4.5 million for the fire department, plus let's call it round number $1 million for the pumper. That all needs to get financed, and that would get financed on the back of the fire rate, of course, over multi-year smoothing of those increases that would align with inflation factors, and the fact that we have other people, about 50% of that revenue stream is outside of Mahone Bay. So my expectation, and this is just one voice in the wilderness, is that we would continue to see fire rates moderate higher. The raw rate would moderate higher as per the long-term plan that we started last year. So, I mean, I don't know how you could spin that, how you could thread that needle any closer, given the fact that we've already made all these investments. The other item would be what I think is our only other area of control at the council level, and that is the infrastructure fees. My expectation is we won't enjoy an area dividend next year, which may or may not happen, but I can't imagine it will happen given what I understand to be the financial position of area. But I would be absolutely open-minded by a direct increase of that fee on a fixed level. So my understanding is that $10 equals $10 increase of the infrastructure fee generates $10,000 in revenue, round numbers. So specific to capital, and of course we have a 1 to 3 multiplier with our capital, as we all know, or whatever dollar of money that the town spends, on average we get $2 of funding from the province and the federal government. So I mean, if the idea here is to fund an incremental $150,000 a year of capital items, we need a $50 increase of the infrastructure fee. $295 to $495, $295 to $345 would give us essentially $150,000 a year of higher capital budget, if you kind of play out that math. So I think that's a prudent and smart way to go, because that's something council can always adjust higher and lower, and it's fixed and it's fair. And it doesn't, and that's not a tax rate discussion, but I do think that I think we are playing with fire if we really start commingling the revenue streams. I think we've done ourselves a great service by having those streams delineated, and I think we should continue to do that. I know Mahone Bay is unusual in that not other towns don't do it the way we do it, and we've kind of backed into it based on our circumstances. But I do think we are far, far better off continuing with that long-term planning strategy. I think it's really helped us, and it's allowed us as a small town to still achieve a lot. And a lot of towns were very envious of the way we've got things set up.
Thank you, Councillor Feeney. Other comments? Deputy Mayor?
I might have lost Councillor Feeney's train of thought around whether we are continuing, will increase the fire rate or not. And I sort of need a little bit of clarity from. Yeah.
I think Deputy Mayor, my understanding of kind of where council had positioned the fire rate historically is we were in the, correct me if I'm wrong, Del, might not have this math completely right, but our peers in Blockhouse were at about, say, 14.5 cents, while Mahone Bay was, let's call it, at 12. And we've been moving the fire rate up to align with kind of the market rates in the other areas, as well as move them up in recognition of these huge capital investments we've made. So I'm losing track, Dylan, on exactly where we are, but I think our long-term plan last year is we were trending over multiple years to 16 cents, give or take.
Yeah, I couldn't comment exactly on where we were headed to, but certainly the intention was that, unlike the operating budget where you say there's no automatic contribution to capital there is an automatic portion of the fire rate that goes directly into the fire capital reserve. And then that's also being used to pay borrowing costs associated with capital. So we did have an understanding that that part would need to increase, over a number of years, and essentially would create a solid stream that would be enough to both cover the payments on the current, $5.5 million of expenditures that you referenced, but then also to be able to contribute to the reserve for purchases within the span of that borrowing. So while that borrowing is still being paid back, we will have 2 more trucks to buy, for example. So that's where the extra would be, just to keep that reserve growing while keeping pace with payments. Any increase in the fire rate, I would suggest is contributing to the fire capital. I don't expect to see tremendous increase in operating costs. We did note that there will be some in association with the new building. Relative to the old building, there are some more operating costs with the new building that we will see, but primarily what we're talking about is planning ahead for understood fire capital so that reserve is not empty when the next thing comes along. But ultimately, it's really just whether we're presenting a draft budget one way or another. So whether it says that staff are direct to present the budget with no increase in tax rate or no increase in tax rate or fire rate. It's a projection of long-term ability to finance capital. You may see it showing a long-term, gap that we're identifying where there's going to be an issue, or maybe, as Councillor Feeney said, over several years, the trends of growing assessment will continue, and that we won't be having that conversation. So,
right.
We're just talking about how staff are directed to present the budget. In that sense, if we present it and there's a clear deficiency that council wishes to address sooner rather than later, we could always provide direction in the budget process to increase the fire rate relative to funding that reserve. So I just want clarity in the motion. I certainly don't have a recommendation that the motion not specify that fire rates be kept as they are today, just to understand what that would mean depending on how we're directed.
Okay.
I think, Mayor, just the last comment, just to be clear to the Deputy Mayor's question, I guess when council reviewed the long-term funding plan behind the approval of the capital for the new fire department, that was subsequently augmented by backstopping our $250,000 of increased contribution. There was an expectation that we would have creeping fire rates. I guess what's the new news that hasn't been woven into the analysis yet is the fact that, wow, Shazam, 20% increase in tax base.
Mhm.
Like if you go back in time 18 months ago to Luke's analysis, he was probably talking about like 3% increases. And remember, I mean, it was we were averaging, I think, Dylan, like 1.5%, 2% increase annually. So the idea we went 1.5%, 2.5%, 20%. I mean, obviously that's going to ripple through. That's going to ripple through to the math. So we should be fine, I would hope.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Feeney. Councillor Wilson. And then,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Carver had her hand up at the top of the screen. Very
by all
small
means.
hand.
Oh, there it is. Little yellow guy.
Councillor Carver.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about the deed transfer tax and how it factors in to the overall numbers. And related to that, I'm curious also about from the provincial budget today, where they said that the province will increase the deed transfer tax for purchasers from outside the province. And so I was confused by that because I thought we set that the municipality set the deed transfer tax. So there's two parts to that question. Or I'm hoping that the CAO could answer that.
Well, I'm not actually 100% on how the province means to collect on the deed transfer tax increase that they're pushing. I think there's been some discussion around that. Presumably, it's being taken off the top at the same time that ours. So the way deed transfer tax is actually remitted is when you file with the land registry. So it's remitted to the town. So presumably they'll just take more than what we would normally get. And I don't know that we're expecting any of that to come back to municipalities at this point. So people will take a larger hit and then we'll just get remitted the same amount that we normally would. Most municipalities are now at the maximum deed transfer tax allowable under the MGA, which is 1.5%. So whatever percentage the province would choose to add will just come off the top for people, and we're still constrained at 1.5% at this point. Did I miss the first part of your question?
Wait, thank you for that part. Yeah, the first part of my question was what role does the deed transfer tax play in our income in terms of amount and how it's used and directed?
Well, the deed transfer tax is directed directly into capital reserve or to fund capital expenditures in current year. It's a pretty variable amount because it's entirely dependent on sale of properties. But that being said, over the last at least 4 or 5 years, it's been growing fairly significantly every year. So, fairly predictably every year. We have bumped up the budget, but it's exceeded, the actuals have exceeded budget pretty much every time. We're trying to be conservative with our projections. So providing kind of a healthy baseline of contribution into the capital reserve, but one that is dependent on, good times with significant economic activity. So if there's a downturn, it will also drop off just as sharply as it has increased. If there's no new construction, there's no deed transfer revenue. Well, new sales.
Sorry. You're happy with that one?
There's no sales, which is,
right,
not the exact same thing, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think you necessarily have to build a building to get a deed transfer tax, but that's not my real question. I guess let me ask a direct question to the CAO, if I may, Your Worship. Does he see any difficulty constructing an operating budget for the town that would be constrained to a 5 or 6% year-over-year increase?
Mr. Mayor, if I can.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would say that there is difficulty at this point. We really don't know accurately at this point what our costs have increased by, but we certainly know there are some areas, like I mentioned, policing services, where would absolutely the cost increase is going to exceed 5 or 6%. So at the end of the day, we hope to offset any increase with some corresponding reduction, but that's not something that is easy to guarantee. And at this point, especially, I don't think we have enough information to say that we could present that budget without a reduction in service levels in some area. So, that's the challenge that I find, is the judgment call at the staff level over which services would be reduced, which priorities are less of a priority. It's usually a council decision. So that's where, staff being constrained in that way is tricky. What I would do is present it with a corresponding operating reserve transfer. So in that sense, absolutely can do it. We've done it for the last couple of years, but we would do it by picking into the operating reserve to cover any increase that would not result in a reduction in services. And then council could have the discussion, because again, this is just the presentation of the initial budget, on whether it would be better to find a reduction in service levels versus to use the operating reserve in that circumstance. So I guess the short answer is we absolutely can deliver a budget with a fixed percentage increase, but not without potentially dipping into the operating reserve to avoid a reduction in service levels.
Yeah.
That I feel like is generally council's decision to make.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question, Your Worship, the reason I asked the question that way was because if we subscribe to what was said a few minutes ago about just instructing, I guess, staff to come back with a budget with a zero tax rate increase, what we are in effect saying is that the operating budget for the town, never minding Councillor Feeney's comments about the infrastructure thing, the operating budget for the town will year over year increase by 20%. And that, to me, I think is untenable.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor, and then the CAO, if you will come back to you, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so I mean, I get where Councillor Wilson is coming from, and I sort of wanted to ask this question to him and probably the CAO. In constructing the budget, and if we can sort of lay a target for ourselves to sort of say we will limit ourselves to between 5 and 10% increase, and that's the max that we'll go to. Will that be a better compromise rather than saying 5% and that's it? Will that work for either side?
If I may, Your Worship, yeah, I'm not on any side, but and I don't have a particular number, but I think it's important that we have targets, because absent targets, it's like everything else. Work will expand to use up the time allowed, and budgets will expand to take up all the money that's available. It's just the way things work. So unless you have a target, it's just totally open-ended. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh, well, just because, Francis, I think you were asking for each of our opinions on that. So, I might maybe answering a question with a question, but I do generally disagree with the characterization that budgets just grow to fill the available space. But if we do have money left over that isn't necessary to maintain current service levels and isn't necessary to address council's various strategic objectives, it would by default go into the operating reserve. So Councillor Wilson made a point about, it's important, the province is telling us it's important, that we feel would be important to grow the operating reserve. So I think at the end of the day, that's really the bigger question is, if staff present an operating reserve transfer and staff says, instead of putting that money in the operating reserve, council says, instead of putting that money in the operating reserve, let's lower the tax burden. I think that's a discussion that council should have, and we'll present it as such, and council would be able to provide that direction. So it's pretty transparent that extra money isn't going to just be used up, that we have an objective. And I think this is where council can set some clear objective to grow the operating reserve. So, that may be in terms of discussion of goals to set within the budget process. And I think Councillor Wilson mentioned this in his opening point. It's the inverse. The goal to grow the operating reserve is a goal to keep operating expenditures low. But it isn't built on the assumption that we'll lower the tax rate. And I honestly think that setting expenditures artificially like that is built on an assumption that the tax rate would be lowered. And that's not necessarily the direction that I think council would provide if properly equipped with the information to make that decision. So making it now before we have a budget, I can see saying no rate increase, but an effective reduction. I think it ties council's hands way too early in the process. I think staff should provide that information and then council can make that decision.
Okay. Deputy Mayor and then Councillor Feeney.
Yeah, just I guess a quick follow-up to wrap up my train of thought. I think so. Both sides, I can see both sides of the argument, and can relate to what is being said. I think the issue of having a target for me makes a lot of sense. I think the question is that target achievable, or is it just an arbitrary target that just makes staff's work much more complicated, and then they end up not providing us with the necessary pieces the necessary information. So when I think about when we say between a 5 and a 10%, it, for me, in my mind, it accommodates the CPI increase and any other increases that might not be within the CPI, and gives us some room to sort of say there can be some increase in costs across the line items. And of course, if there's any money left over, the understanding it goes to operating results for that particular purpose. But at least you have a guiding principle going into it that we've all agreed upon, and everybody feels comfortable that that's the approach. And I think that's what Councillor Wilson is trying to bring to the table in a different way, sort of saying, well, let's go into this saying we are working within these margins, and that's what we are looking for. You will eventually might come up and sort of say, well, I couldn't achieve the 10%. It went to 12 or 15, and we can start having that conversation. But at least we'll know that staff have taken into account that council really wants to keep us within a 10% increase, so to speak.
Councillor Feeney?
I guess just to clarify, Francis, when you're meaning a 10% operating expense increase, that's what you're, yeah, okay. Yeah, I can get my head around that as a baseline CP, like 2x CPI sounds like that's a good restraint. Like the idea that we would be increasing operating expenses at twice the rate of inflation would have to be supported by some monumentally high numbers coming from the items that we don't control, which is fair enough. I mean, if that's reality, that's reality, but at least that's a reality that we can speak to. Like if education costs go up by 12%, if policing goes up by 30%, if the math behind that drives us to 2 times inflation for the overall pool, the overall operating budget, it's like, so be it. But at least there's a logic behind it. I guess one thing that I would say is that, like, I think that is an admirable. I think we've been directed by the province, and we've tried, but our operating reserve now is very low. In fact, it's so low that we actually had to essentially transfer money out of the capital reserve to the operating reserve to function over the period of COVID. So, like, it is progress if we just don't have to do that anymore. But some of our revenue streams on the capital side are under pressure. Dylan just spoke well to detransfer tax. Like, we're not going to be able to bank on 200 grand a year of detransfer tax, like, down the road. And I also don't think we're going to be able to bank on any dividend from area, which is another, 130, it's been as high as 200,000 not so many years ago. like I'm fully expecting that our next year's budget for area will be 0. So I think we really do need to figure out the balance of the revenue streams on how much people can afford to pay, because if we just simply spend all of our energy talking about the operating side, we won't have any money to do any of the capital items. And I think honestly, that's what the taxpayers see. And I think we need to continue to make progress on the capital side as well. So I don't mind taking, if we were going to Dylan's point, if the idea was we were going to keep the tax rate the same, but some of that tax revenue was going to be directed at capital. Now that's the first time that's happened in 25 years. But if we were going to do that, like I'd be open-minded to hear about what new bells and whistles we were going to get all around in the infrastructure that would come from that, because at least there'd be a plausible story and a rationale behind why the tax rate would be what it is. So Dylan, I mean, it's hard. Like this is the hardest thing councils do, is come up with these budgets. So I guess we should all count our lucky stars that we're somewhat fortunate that like it at least looks like we're going to be able to have lots of resources. The question is just how much can people afford, and what's reasonable to expect that we can take from them.
Dylan, Mr. Hyde.
I think well said, Councillor Feeney, and I just wanted to note, I think you touched on, but just for anyone else around the table here or people viewing to have a clear understanding, there was about $60,000 in the current year operating budget that was essentially a deferred rate increase. So we had an increase in costs, an increase in expenditures over the last couple of years, and that was essentially plugged by dipping into the operating reserve for that. So we're not really talking about offsetting expenditures in the current year. First, we have to make up the $60,000 annual shortfall, and then we're talking about in the current year. So I think that's an important note, and I think that Joe, is right to recognize that, just eliminating that as a year-to-year built up, and this is a result of COVID. Council wanted to keep tax burdens down over the last couple of years. We weren't experiencing any significant growth in assessment. In fact, in commercial, it was declining. And so we didn't want to have any significant increase in rates, but we have experienced a typical increase in costs over the last couple of years. So we did that by banking on this type of an increase in assessment. And congratulations to council. It was very well timed. It was good judgment in that respect. We made it through COVID, and now there's an increase in assessment that will prevent that from being born with a rate increase. But I think it's important to understand that the first thing we're doing is eliminating that $60,000 cost per year that has been deferred, and then we're talking about what the current year tax increase is. So from last year's expenditures to this year's expenditures, growth isn't going to constrain that. Like as a direction to staff, if you say expenditures are to grow by no more than 10% over the prior year, that's not going to constrain that. That's only over the prior year, and the prior year was financed from operating reserve. So in that sense, I'm not objecting to the notion of a 10% increase with this comment, just to note that over and above keeping that current year cost down, we're going to be able to, I think, without any increase in taxes, address the costs that have risen over the last 2 years that council had deferred to this point. And it won't be that obvious to people what an accomplishment it was to keep taxes low over the last few years, when a number of other communities didn't. And so council made that decision, and it was a correct decision based on what we're seeing now with the assessment roll. So anyway, all that is to say, well, I think 10% increase in expenditures is an arbitrary cap. Council can tonight either direct us to present a budget with no increase in tax rate, or a budget with no increase in tax rate and expenditures capped at no more than a 10% growth over the prior year, or one or both. I suppose you could do the expenditures without the tax rate cap, although it seems like everyone around the table understood that the tax rates being kept where they were last year is something that we can achieve within this current year budget.
Thank you. Any other comment? Councillor Wilson? Good to go? Deputy Mayor?
So in wanting just to be very, very clear in what we are agreeing upon. So far we've agreed no increase in tax rates. I think we are agreeing on, I guess, getting not more than 10% increase in operational, a sort of what we're looking towards, knowing that there might be a good, I think there will be a good narrative for us to sort of talk about that 60,000 that we've covered. There was a deficit from the previous years. For me, it's important for us to note that, so that in the budget narrative, once we're done, at least that's communicated in a clear way, because I think it's an important piece to cover. Are those, so if we're going to do any, I guess, recommendations or motions out of this, are those two lines something we've agreed upon clearly, or are there still questions around those?
Council?
Silence means agreement, I guess. Okay.
We agree. We'll
So we
worry
should
about
get-
the motion later.
Yeah, maybe
Councillor
Deputy Mayor
Carver, you
wants
look
to make a
perplexed.
motion.
Councillor Carver's got a question, I think.
No, I'm only looking perplexed because I'm not quite sure what's going to happen or what the process is. That's all.
I think we're just trying to clarify that the members of council agree in principle with the statements that the deputy mayor is making, and that we would, when the time for a motion comes, we can
Yeah.
expect it will be supported.
So for the record, I'm 100% in favor of the first part, to keep the tax rate stable. Less strongly interested in the second part, but I can live with it.
The second part being no increase
The
in
10%.
expenditures?
No, the 10% cap,
Oh, okay.
if somebody's making a motion.
Okay, Councillor Feeney. You're on mute, sir.
Sorry, Mayor. I think the most important part of this meeting is the next 5 minutes to make sure we're all speaking the same language and exactly what we're saying.
Mhm.
So based on the deputy mayor's points about some parameters, which is, budget parameters, keeping the tax rate flat as a constraint. Okay, I think Kelly's made the point well. If that's true, we're notionally going to have 20% more revenue than we did a year ago. Although I think Dylan mentioned, and I agree wholeheartedly, the year over years are not a great comparison because we artificially depressed last year's budget and funded part of last year's budget out of operating reserves. Fair enough. Totally agree.
Okay.
That's 3 cents of the tax rate. That 60,000 bucks. So that's real. That's 2.5% of the overall budget, right? A 2.5% increase in the budget. So I'm okay with that as a constraint. I'm also okay as a budget planning constraint to say the operating expenses we're going to try to shoehorn them into 10% growth. Fair enough. And Dylan may have some success to do that, or he may not. But that still doesn't mean that there's not going to be more revenue than that. I guess the question is, what do you do with the other several $100,000s of increased revenue that comes in? I think what I've heard is right now the plan will be to put that surplus will go to the operating reserve. Fair enough. If that's the plan, I could live with that. I do think that still leaves us short cash to fund the capital items that we're going to talk about in the next item. And we talk about it every council meeting all year long. I don't believe we have sufficient revenue to fund the capital program that we as a council aspire to. And the two constraints that we have, I think, general agreement around doesn't address that at all. So I'm okay with that right now, as long as we're all open-minded to talk about the other piece of it. in my mind, I would be supporting a $50 increase in the infrastructure fee as a way to finance the capital gap. But I know I may be in the minority on that point, and open-minded about trying to figure out what we all could agree on.
Okay. Deputy Mayor?
I was trying to clarify the rest so that we can move to that that point exactly. So that excess revenue, what do we do with it? What does council want to do with it? I don't have numbers or figures in mind, but I would want us to consider putting some of that towards capital. I know you might disagree with me on that. I think some of that definitely should go into the reserves, operational reserves, but maybe some of that can go into capital so that so for me, when I think about the increasing cost, whether it's an infrastructure charge or the tax increase, I would want us not to increase anything if we can do that. So for the population, if we can do that, I'll be a happy camper. Now I know we might be forced at some point to increase that, but I sort of get the sense that we're at a place where we don't have to because we have more revenue. So why wouldn't we just find a way to if we need some money for infrastructure, figure out how much of that we want to put into reserves and how much of that we want to put into capital, and see if we can agree on a either percentage or a figure that we are comfortable with. Now, if we can't agree on the principle itself, then we have problems there, and maybe I might need to understand maybe a little bit more as to I guess the philosophical background as to why that would be problematic, because I probably don't understand it fully.
Okay. Mr. Hyde, how do you feel about the suggestion that we would basically live within our means, I think? You know, with the increased revenues that the increased assessments will bring.
Yeah, I think that we have probably a workable motion at this point, looking something like this. The fire tax rate is highlighted there because that was the point of discussion. I think Deputy Mayor was essentially saying the fire tax rate should be in the motion in order to provide clarity, and we'll see how that budget looks, and we can have that discussion at budget time. So if this were the motion, certainly I feel that the new manager of finance and myself can work within this. And then that essentially leaves this question of excess revenue over expenditures, being as expenditures are capped at not more than 10%, and we expect the revenue to increase more than 10%. What do we do with that? And we can make that a part of the budget exercise. So, you know, that's a discussion to have at budget time. It's going into reserve, so we can, you know, then talk about whether it's going to capital reserve. I would actually be loath to fix a percentage contribution to capital reserve at this stage anyway. You know, I think we should just look at that as excess revenue over expenditures and then talk about, you know, capital or operating reserve or tax rate reduction, which, you know, I'm on record as saying I think that it should be put in reserves because this is not an absolute guarantee of future growth in perpetuity.
Councillor, thank you, CAO. Councillor Carver?
Yes, before the CAO spoke, I was reacting to the Deputy Mayor and Councillor Feeney's comments about making that I understood to be asking for decisions about any excess funds that we might have, and it just seemed to me to be too early in the game to be making decisions about that. There may be all sorts of information available later in the process that would guide us in making that decision. So I wouldn't want to make that kind of commitment at this point, but I'm happy to support the motion, the draft motion that the CAO posted a minute ago.
And the commitment that we're making, CAO, with that motion is to give you and your staff some parameters for developing the budget. Okay. Councillor Wilson, your reaction.
I'm generally okay. I don't like the quantified answer I got, but I think the qualified commentary has been very helpful. I would, as a general principle, be happier if we adjusted tax rate up or down, depending on what our needs were from an operating point of view, and then to use Councillor Feeney's commentary, adjust the capital streams, the ones that we can control, which I guess is just the infrastructure charge, to fund that portion of our business. But I'm okay with what we got to, so I'm fine.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Feeney.
Like, I'll support the motion. I think this is an excellent place to start, but this is a huge tax increase for people. So if you just think about your own individual assessments and increase how they've increased this year, even at a flat tax rate, I mean, you're going to see most people in town paying many hundreds of dollars more this year in property tax. So again, as long as we are all confident that we can communicate value for money, either through maintaining excellent service levels or improving the experience of living in town because of excellent infrastructure and potential upgrades, and a few bells and whistles on the side, then I can get my head around it. But there'll be a lot of people that are going to be paying more than an extra $100 a month in property taxes if we go with this route. So I'm okay with it tonight. We'll let it play out over the next couple months.
Mr. Hyde.
Councillor Feeney just reminded me of something I wanted to mention that's kind of a positive in terms of our budget process. The release of household income data is supposed to happen July 13th. This is from the 2021 census. So an opportunity to revamp our low income rebate system in line with that new data, which we had talked about last year, but we were waiting for the new census data. So in terms of the burden and the increase, just want to certainly suggest that this was the year we'd planned to look again at those low income thresholds and see if there was some additional relief that could be offered. So that's an opportunity as well. Well timed with our delayed budget, because we wouldn't have had that in time otherwise.
Okay. Councillor Now, and then Councillor Carver, and then the Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I have just brought up a point that Councillor Feeney brought up. I would certainly like it if we could at least bring the tax rate down a little bit, even if that means bringing up the other taxes for infrastructure to another $50 per household. That's going to be less. They're going to be saving more in the end by taking the tax rate down a few cents and then just putting that on so that we keep things in the proper perspective as to what they're going towards. That way we know that $50 per household is going into capital, and we don't have to worry about where it's coming from as far as the anything we might be over.
Okay, Mr. Hyde, did you want to address Councillor Now?
I'm sorry, I just keep thinking of things that are relevant to the consideration of people around the table. So I just wanted to mention, with respect to Councillor Now's comment, that just so that people understand, I totally love the idea of dedicated streams. Obviously, as staff, where that's what we love to see. But in terms of increasing the flat charge per property as an offset of a reduced tax rate, what we are talking about is an increasing flat cost and a decreasing cost that is supposedly income dependent. And I understand it's an imperfect instrument, but there's no question that an increase in the infrastructure fee relative to a reduction in tax rate is a redistribution of the tax burden downwards to people with less ability to pay by definition. It may be imperfect, but that is part of the impact. So I just want it to be understood around the table again, further justification to look at that low income rebate and ensure that it offsets any potential unintended impacts of increasing the flat charge relative to the assessment based charge.
Councillor Carver, and then Deputy Mayor.
So I'd like to ask another process question. So if we pass this motion tonight, which is to bring in a budget that that keeps the tax rate flat, it seems to me that it's entirely possible that when we get to the end of the budget discussions, we could rethink that. It's not, I mean, it's not a forever promise. We're not bound to it. We could, by the end of this, say, oh, it looks a little bit different from this perspective. I mean, I believe that that's true. Is there any reason why we couldn't do that? And then consider a lower tax rate or some other variation on this theme? I mean, these are just guidelines to go forward with.
CAO, what's your reaction to that?
Oh, I just took it as rhetorical, but yes, Councillor Carver, you're correct. There is no reason that that couldn't happen. And, you know, I characterize the exercise at the end of the day of excess revenues over expenditure growth, which we see happening automatically based on the motion. There would be as a discussion of, is this going to fund operating reserves? Is this going to fund capital reserve? There is a third option. The third option is a reduction in rates. So really that conversation has three options on the table. And while it is my recommendation that we do one of those other two and not the third, that's going to be staff's recommendation every time. You all know that. So that's a discussion for council to have at that point in the process.
So just to follow up on Councillor Carver, this motion would allow for, the way you describe it, either one of those three events occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. It would guarantee the council would have that decision to make, and staff would essentially be presenting that as the option for a certain amount of money that would be defined in the course of the budget process. Which way do we want it to go of those three options?
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor Kangata.
Yeah, I think that the last comments sort of clarified what I wanted to raise, is that these are just parameters to get us to a place where we have a budget that we can have deliberations about. The last piece there about what if we have excess, where and how are we going to spend it? I think I came to that because I was trying to sort of get us to a place where we have a not a fixed agreement, but just a good understanding, which will make our budget deliberations easier. If we have these pre-budget conversations, it sort of puts us in a place where we have a same level of understanding as to what impacts some of the changes we might talk about will have. And that's why I wanted to get to an understanding of, we already have the motion that we will make, but an understanding of, if we have extra revenue, the idea of either taking it to capital or operational reserves, what that means and what it impacts, and either from a operational perspective or a philosophical perspective, what the difference is. It would be best for me to clarify that now, rather than us get into that conversation and now start going back and rehashing something we should have had a conversation about. The sense I get is in the room is that folks would be okay with that. It's just a matter of us making sure we have a very good narrative as to why we're making the choices we're making, whether to take it to operational reserves, whether to take it to capital, or whether we're doing a reduction in taxes, so to speak. Am I on the wrong path there, thinking that way?
Nope.
I think you are on the same track,
Okay.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you.
But those three options do exist, and it will be part of the work that council will be doing with staff in developing the budget. Does somebody wish to make a motion? Deputy Mayor, are you making that motion?
Yeah, so moved as was displayed by the CEO.
And the Councillor Carver seconds it. Okay. Do we need the motion read just to be sure?
I'm happy to do it if it's helpful.
Yes, please.
The motion was that staff be directed to present the 2022-23 budget with no increase in tax rate or fire tax rate, and general operating expenditures increased by not more than 10%.
That is my understanding. You've heard the motion on the question. All in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you. Now we can move on to the next piece of the budget process in a short order and in time. No further questions. The next item is the ICIP priorities resolution. There is a note that was the CAO had prepared and sent out on the relative costs. Mr. CAO, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So earlier this month, we had a discussion about bringing the same two projects forward for ICIP funding consideration as we did back in, I think the original was 2019 was our original application. So in 2019, we defined two projects on Main Street comprising the massive bulk of depreciated infrastructure in the town's water wastewater systems being the Main Street lines. Obviously, they serve the majority of people. There are depreciated lines in some areas of town as well, but Main Street serves the whole community and is the backbone to that system, and it mostly dates back to 1949. So those lines that need to be done at the time, back in 2019, we had two projects defined pretty much exactly the same way they are now. I'll comment on two changes. One was 1.34 million and one was 4.1 million. So we made a couple of changes to those, but primarily the change that we're seeing now is increase in costs. We talk a lot about this with COVID. So what was 1.34 has become 1.74, and what was 4.1 has become 5.4. So those changes, substantial changes, are new estimates that we received back from our engineer on this. There are two changes baked into those that do account for, in one case, a reduction, the other case, an increase. It's hard to believe there's a reduction baked into this. Project number one, Main Street East. So this is going on Main Street from, well, it was described as from Fairmont Street heading out towards the town limit on the coastal road to Lunenburg. The change here was that the substantive change, other than increasing costs, was that previously the line was understood to be, the water line was understood to be of a certain character, of a certain age, and characteristic, it's smaller, from Fairmont Street to Faubourg Road. But having looked back at this over the years, we've had 3 years, and we've been improving our asset management information, it's now understood that that line actually begins around, there's a Civic in here, 586 Main, so that's basically the pizza place around that spot on Main Street, rather than at Fairmont Street. So we had been talking about replacing that line. It's still the same line, but there's actually more of it than we had thought at the time. So there is a change here to have that full section, because there's not a lot of point in leaving a little snippet of that smaller scale line in between doing a new section. It will really reduce the benefits of the work. So that was the substantive change. And then project number two, Main Street West, this is headed up Main Street towards Long Hill and out to Blockhouse. There's a reduction in scope over the prior year despite the increase in costs, and that corresponds to the work that is underway with McLeod Group, support from Main Street up to the treatment plant, which would have previously been included in this number. So hard to believe that that is a reduction of about $700,000. So we'd be looking at a $6 million project rather than a $5.36 million project. So that's to our benefit, because we're already doing the work, but it's still a tremendous cost increase. Just we're looking at an increase in the construction costs, an increase in materials costs. The good news to all of this is was included in my email, which is that when you actually break down the projected funding shares here, we're not talking about such extraordinary sums. Project one, Main Street East Water Wastewater Rehabilitation Extension on the way out towards Lunenburg, essentially becomes about a $500,000 project for the town, split essentially equally between town general and the water utility. So about a $250,000 project for each town general, the water utility. The remaining 1.3 million approximately, that's coming from federal and provincial sources. So we're leveraging tremendous contribution there. coming up with that $250,000. Obviously it's substantial investment from the town and the water utility. Good news on the water utility side, we have built these into rates now for 3 years. So our rates have been putting aside a little bit of money for capital. It's really intended more to absorb the cost of borrowing than to actually put the full amount aside. We really were not capable of doing that, but at least the borrowing costs will not cause another tremendous spike in water rates, or at least that's been the intention. There will be a bit of one because, of course, the projects are this much more expensive than they were projected to be back in 2019. And project 2, the same thing, essentially, what would be a project with net HST, about $5.6 million project, becomes about $750,000 for town general and $750,000 for the water utility. So overall, we're basically talking almost exactly about $1 million contribution from town general and $1 million contribution from the water utility to affect a $7.5 million improvement to our infrastructure. So it is a tremendous value. That's the nature of this program, but it's also a pretty significant contribution. The water utility would be paying it from borrowing, and certainly my recommendation would be at this time for the town to also pay the town general share by borrowing. Although, if we get into discussion, maybe some contribution towards that to reduce the borrowing level from reserve could be contemplated. It's just a discussion to have at budget time. So I presume the council wants to go ahead with these projects, but before asking for a resolution in that respect, take any questions that there may be at this time. And I'll just further note, we're allowed 2 projects. Doesn't mean we're going to get both of them. And they may further ask us to break down the second one into a couple of projects as well. Although relatively speaking, it's big for us, but they will be receiving other applications larger than this from larger municipalities.
Okay. Councillor Feeney.
Just to clarify, Dylan, the second project, is that from the two endpoints? Is that from still from Cherry Lane all the way to the Blockhouse town boundary, or has that changed as well?
No, project 2 is more than that. Yeah, no, sorry. Well, it's so from Cherry Lane to the Blockhouse boundary includes replacement of any water, wastewater, stormwater, and raw water transmission infrastructure within that entire stretch, including the upgrade of the water lines to an increased dimension, and most particularly an upgrade of the water lines also on the stretch from the treatment plant out to the Blockhouse boundary, where that's well, I don't know what to call it. It's an undersized line as we currently have there now. So yes, you're correct to characterize that, Joe. I just want to emphasize all the different pieces that are picked up within that area, not just water.
And sorry, Dylan, one last question. When we talk about that budget, does that budget replace all the work and repave the road, or just kind of dig up the middle and repave a patch in the middle of the road?
Well, it's essentially as necessary, but it will be necessary to fully resurface the road in this case. So it does include the resurfacing of the road. The current line that is located from, again, towards Blockhouse boundary is not located in the center of the road. And depending on that, I don't know if it's a half, it may only include a half job of repaving up there, although we generally want to do the whole thing. And I, always ask for the whole thing. I'm not sure if in that case we're just doing the water line, if it was included as the full repave job, but that is generally the approach.
And sorry, Mayor, for monopolizing the questions, but
We're charging you by the minute, Councillor.
If we go back to the Pleasant Street experience with the homeowners on Pleasant Street, there was a lot of feedback to council at the time about the curb and gutter only being on one side of the street and not the curb and gutter on the other side of the street. And there was always a question of, well, if you're going to do all this work, why wouldn't you contemplate putting curb on the other side of the street? Which is, I always thought was a fair question, but our budgeting and our deliberations never included that originally, so it never happened. I think that is, as the deputy mayor says, can we learn any lessons from the past? I think that was one, if you recall, I think that would be a wise thing for us to investigate. We probably don't do it due to cost constraints, but I think it would be important and I'm not sure, Dylan, if this is causing you any grief or not, but what the true cost of providing curb on both sides. And maybe we can't even do it from a town works perspective. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there.
CAO is going to respond, then we'll go to the deputy mayor.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing to get the costs on at some point, but it probably would run into eligibility issues in this case, because this is really funding for water, wastewater. So if it's not reinstatement of existing, and we can term that broadly, you know, reinstate as much of the existing stuff as you can possibly do. But if it's not existing, then that's a tougher case to make. So I would be satisfied if we managed to make the case that we can do some sidewalk replacement on Upper Main Street, where it is in sore shape right now around the corner of Long Hill there. But yeah, any additional sidewalk, we're better off. Well, the next item on the agenda tonight, a fund like the Federal Active Transportation Fund would provide 60% funding for a big stretch of sidewalk on the other side of Main Street, for example. So that might be, you know, a funding source we could look at for that. But I would say not something we have time to include in this, but also I don't think it would be an eligible cost component.
Deputy Mayor?
Well, I think Dylan's last comment sort of in some way answered my question. I was sort of wondering, I know there were talks and ideas around having a sidewalk on that on that side of Main Street, and whether if we're going to be doing that much work, ripping apart, I guess, a lot of that side, whether that might be a good investment for us to think about, and what kind of funding we might be able to get. So I'll be looking forward to seeing your suggestions.
Yeah, I think it'd be something to separately explore, but if we were going to get the cost done up, you know, the engineering estimates done up for that, even not for this application, provide council with that information. But we are probably talking about a couple $1,000s worth of work to prepare those estimates. So would want some direction from council, and we've done this on a number of items already this year, to say that staff be directed to obtain estimates on the cost to add sidewalk from this point to this point for the 2020-23 budget discussion. So that's something that we could do a motion on, but I just, you know, would want to understand that cost was anticipated by council.
So we can have a motion for projects 1 and 2 as presented, that the staff develop the applications for that, but and also include the funding requirements or the project requirements to provide the sidewalk in the same motion, or we'll do it as a separate?
We do it as a separate motion, because the motion to approve the application to the ICIP is kind of a set format.
Sure. Okay.
I can show you, but it's not as lengthy as like a TBR
No.
motion or something. But
So we would entertain a motion, Councillor Feeney?
Sorry, Mayor, I didn't want to, you know, add fly to the ointment here. You know, I do think if we are going to start talking about sidewalk expansion, there are lots of places in town that probably need to be addressed first before we augmented the other side of Main Street, like the side of the Main Street that I live in, for example. I wouldn't think would be a priority versus some of the other areas of town that don't have any sidewalks yet.
Any sidewalks.
Specifically Fobo Road from Main Street up to Pleasant. To me, that strikes me as a higher priority. I guess where my thinking on asking the question was really around curb and gutter versus sidewalk, but anyway, I'll leave it there. I'd be more curious about the cost of the curb and gutter, and whether from an engineering perspective, that would even be something that would be beneficial. I mean, snow removal, storm runoff, like I'm out of my depth here on the issues. I know that Derek had lots of engineering drivers on why curb on both sides of Pleasant Street was not an excellent idea, or would be an idea that we could achieve only with a great deal of money. So I'm out of my depth here. All I know is that there were a lot of people asking the question after Pleasant Street got built. And I think that it would be prudent for us to at least have some due diligence done on the curb on Main Street, just so that we could speak to it intelligently.
Okay. So for now, we would entertain a motion to direct staff to prepare the application for projects 1 and 2 as described here. Okay. Councillor Wilson moves, Councillor Burdick seconds. Okay, you've heard the motion. On the question. All in favor? Motion's carried.
Well,
Did
let's
we
hope we
wanna-
do better than we did in 2019.
That's right. That's right. So we can save the discussion for the sidewalks/sidewalk extension and curbing for a separate venue.
Yeah, I mean, I had misunderstood Councillor Feeney's point about the curbing. I mean, I can look into. I also would not have never seen and generally wouldn't recommend an approach with a curb on the one side of the street that doesn't have a sidewalk. I'm sort of trying to get my head around it, but it's a question I can certainly talk to the engineer who prepared this just to have that perspective.
Okay.
But any further discussion about sidewalks, I agree, it may be a more robust conversation than we have time to have this evening. But it can happen at council's discretion. I don't think it's a bad discussion to have. And the section that Councillor Feeney mentioned on Faubourg between Pleasant and Main is actually, I think, the only sidewalk extension that is currently speculated in the long-term capital budget. It is on that list.
Well, let's hope, as you say, that our ICIP applications get more positive attention than they did the last time. Let's go to Federal Active Transportation Fund application, Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this one is it's a little bit unanticipated. We were directed to be on the lookout for opportunities to apply to this fund last fall, and when we were successful with the Connect 2 application, that picked up a lot of the transportation projects that we had on our list in terms of eligibility. Things having to do with the cycling can be covered under that, so trail connections and that kind of thing. But what that essentially left, and as Martha had provided for in this report, since she does our active transportation stuff, was essentially one project that we had on our list. So rather than kind of going around and coming up with new projects, which isn't really staff's role to brainstorm, we looked at the list and said, wait a minute, there's a substantial component of the Living Shoreline project. It's actually the part that people talk to me the most often about, more so than the actual Living Shoreline, which was to improve the safety of people, cyclists and pedestrians transiting on Edgewater Street between the church parking areas and Keddies. You see a lot of people there, strollers, walkers, everything, buses let off down at Keddies and people walk along the waterfront. And, so the plan in 2016 was that as part of this improvement of the Living Shoreline, we would be also getting to fill in a little bit there, new armoring everything, and therefore have a widened shoulder where we could support an active transportation trail. So what the suggestion here is, there's a federal funding program. It's quite substantial. It's 60%, and the application maximum's $50 million. So we're certainly well below that. And because we're having this ongoing pilot with CBCL on, a small section of the proposed Living Shoreline in front of the Anglican Church with Coastal Action, we had the opportunity to discuss with CBCL how a two-phased approach to that shoreline project might work. So, if we were to put materials on site and those materials were going to be relocated as a second phase, that's much like what's being done as part of the current project. They're going to take the existing armoring and they're going to relocate it and they're going to change that configuration. And so could we design a two-phase approach to, say, the section between the end of the church parking lots and Keddies, where, that's the most imminent risk of washout of the road. It's the most, the currently the least protected area. There are areas there it's not armored at all, really. And without having a lot of sunken costs, there's obviously some, and pardon the pun here when we're talking about shoreline improvement, we would be able to accomplish the goals around the active transportation piece and make a significant step towards the intended Living Shoreline improvement. And make that something that could be argued as eligible for 60% funding under the active transportation program. So essentially, this is an opportunity that we see, but per council's earlier discussion, it's one that still requires us to be willing to put money on the table to fund the town's share of this improvement, which is not insubstantial. But where the Living Shoreline has been on our capital list now for, at least 6 years anyway. I think as a concept and as a fleshed out concept with pricing for, the last number of years. And it just continues to increase in costs. And we haven't come up with a fund that will fund all of it. Breaking a piece off of it and applying seemed like something we might want to do. So unfortunately, there is a little bit of a time crunch. CBCL hasn't actually got us the estimate here, which is pretty necessary to filing an application. But I did provide Martha with some figures around, here's how it could look, and she did include those in the report. So essentially what we're looking at is, does council want to take a crack at this? We may not get the funding. The worst case scenario, I suppose, is that we do get the funding and we get to do our project, but we have to have some money to do it. So yeah, looking for council's feedback on this, and if there's a desire to take the opportunity that we make the resolution around the application, because even though we don't have the final amount of money, we do need a resolution approving us to apply, and it would have to have been made before the 31st. We'll get that amount of money in the next 3 days. We'll forward that to council, but we don't have another meeting that is scheduled. So not ideal, but that's the situation.
Questions? Councillor Carver.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the creative thinking in splitting it up and as a way of perhaps moving ahead. And it would be wonderful to have that walking trail in place. I would like to understand better the implications of splitting the two parts of the project, because it feels a little bit like digging up the road twice somehow. So I hope you can disabuse me of that image. So once the trail is in place, what is the reuse of materials and what it's sort of estimating a minimal cost, but we don't really know that yet. So maybe you can just provide a bit more information about that two-stage process.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And, it is going to be dependent on the estimates coming back from CPCL to see, overall, what are we talking about in terms of an increase in the project cost. So if it's approximately $3 million project, doing it in 2 phases might make it a $3.5 million project, for example. And that 500,000 ends up being there's some additional material, but mostly moving of redeploying of existing material. So we wouldn't be talking about digging up the trail or the road. We would just be talking about any armoring placed on the outside of the trail having to then be removed. And dependent on what CVCL says coming back on this, potentially leaving the trail as a gravel surface, a crusher dust and gravel surface, which is the condition of the rest of the trail as it goes past the church parking lots currently. The long term in the original living shoreline design, and as recommended from an accessibility standpoint, is to pave or at least chip seal that trail. That probably would be better saved or held over, but I'm waiting on CVCL's estimates. But I think the current situation makes it easier to come back and move that without a lot of damage. I think if we have a paved surface there might be additional costs to reinstate for damage that would occur during that process. So yeah, that's essentially the recommendation at this stage is, the cost would be come back and take the armor rock like we're doing with the pilot, move it further offshore, fill in between with the natural, plant life area that is intended for the rest of the pilot.
Thank you, CAO. Any other questions? Councillor Feeney.
Sorry, Mayor, I didn't have a chance to review the budget for this project. And so this is 60-40, Dylan, is the idea. And what's the sticker price for this piece of the work?
Well, that's the tricky part, is we don't actually have it. Well, all we have here is a notion that, presuming the cost update from CBCL that will come back in the next probably 24 hours, but just didn't come in time, shows that the project has, let's say, increased by a little bit in terms of, costs have grown from 2020 was the last time we had this updated. So we're talking about maybe a $3 million project overall. If it was one project, then you break it into 2. This one might be about, half of that. And if it were, then our share at 40% would be somewhere in the ballpark of $600,000. Yeah. And that's kind of where we end up without having the knowledge. We will get it confirmed. And if CBCL says something and it's wildly out of step with that, we don't have to submit the application, obviously. But that's my expectation is going to come in that range.
Is this type of capital investment eligible for municipal finance court financing?
Yes, it would be. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah,
essentially,
the only thing we'd
borrow.
have to get it, we'd have to get a TBR approved. So,
Yeah.
you know, to our conversation about tax rates and burdens on residents and all that kind of stuff, it would obviously they'd have to assess our ability to pay for that borrowing if we're borrowing for the 600,000 or whatever it comes out to. But if you look at that, you know, this is a long-lasting improvement. You know, you can reasonably borrow over 15 years, 20 years for something like that. Armoring's going to stay good for that long. So it's not a tremendous annual cost relative to, you know, we've been waiting a long time for this and it is a priority. So if we say, you know, this current influx of money that we've talked about, you know, what is it going to go to? And then we were to do a project like this and explain to the community that, you know, this increase in assessment that has happened is allowing the town to move forward with projects like this. I think, you know, that's the narrative the council would be able to put out there.
Okay. Councillor Wilson.
Well, absent that last little piece of argument, I'm pleased and impressed to see that we've latched onto this opportunity, not least because the comment in the letter that I read said that this will enhance the likelihood of getting the other half of the money and completing the project. And if that's the case, then I'm definitely in favor. Although I think we need to do it with no tax increase, of course.
Deputy Mayor liked that last one, Councillor Wilson.
No, Councillor Wilson has a champagne lifestyle with a with a beer budget.
Not even beer these days. I have to make my own wine.
I hear you. So I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense if we're able to leverage funding that's available to do these kinds of stuff. I mean, it complicates our conversation around what we're going to do with the excess monies. But I think, like the CEO said, maybe that can be that opportunity to show what we can do potentially without reducing folks' taxes. So I'm supportive of it.
Okay.
Worst case scenario, we get to do it, as Dylan said.
Councillor Carver.
Yes, this is a follow-up to a comment that Councillor Feedy made about the Municipal Finance Corporation. Are we getting near our limit with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very reasonable question. We'll get the new finance manager in preparation for this budget to run the numbers, but Luke's forecast for fire expenditures, you know, we were just on the basis of the fire station, fire hall, and then aforementioned $5.5 million of expenditure, likely to be at that 15, the ratio of 15%. Now that ratio is it's at 15% that the province is supposed to look closely at the necessity of the expenditure. So we start to get into the question of, is this an essential expenditure or not from that perspective? I always remember Councillor Bain and the previous council arguing, this is a provincial highway. You know, they have to understand the necessity of protecting a provincial highway. So, you know, hopefully that case can be argued. It's at 30% that you actually cap out. They're not supposed to let you go above 30%. And I don't know if they're even able to under legislation. We're not getting close to that limit at this stage. And, you know, if we were to get this and we were to get the approval for the ICIP projects and we were to do both of them, you know, all of those things considered, we would certainly be pushing that limit. But these are all the types of investments that the province has been encouraging us to make. You know, these are the things that are depreciated that need to be funded.
Well, I think it would make the town proud, really. I mean, if we can do that, if we can pull it off.
Okay, you have a suggested motion in your package. Entertain a motion that Council Carver, have you got the motion in front of you? You're on mute, madam.
I move that council direct staff to apply for the active transportation fund for the Edgewater Street Shoreline Active Transportation Trail project.
Thank you, Councillor Carver. Seconded, Deputy Mayor. You've heard the motion. On the question. All in favor? Motion's carried. CAO, I believe that is the final item on our open agenda. So we will now go into closed session. Before we do that, we will, are there any folks watching at home, Clerk? Any questions?
There are folks watching, and we do not have any questions, no.
Thank you, Clerk. Well, thank you to those folks at home who have taken the time again tonight to watch their council discussing the issues. And we thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to having you back with us at the next council meeting. And we would now entertain a motion to go in camera. Councillor Wilson moves. Do we have a seconder?